The person who really knows Reverend Livingston, however, is Doug Berkey, and Doug is going to introduce him at this time.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy. What a treat, what a delight for me this evening to welcome my dear friend, Michael Livingston. I say we go back a few years. 7th grade, I guess, is when we first connected, and have not seen a lot of each other than our 10-year reunions and an occasional other type of circumstance. But I think I was talking to somebody just a few minutes ago. I feel I knew Michael was doing great things, but I wasn't really aware of how great, how significant, how important his career has been, the things he's accomplished. As I thought about who would be the first non-LDS speaker, I said, we've got to get Michael. And when I talked to him on the phone, there was this, what do we call it, a pregnant pause? And he said, beg your pardon? And so we talked about it a little bit, and I think I pretty much gave him permission to talk about anything he wanted to talk about. So I'm delighted that he said yes, and he and Nancy flew from Louisville, Kentucky, from where he was doing some other work to join us this evening. One of the most impressive things about Michael, I have to say, is that he shared with me this evening, the fact that in his basketball career at Dorsey High School, that he shot 100% for free throws. Absolutely. Now you might ask how many free throws there were involved, but 9 free throws, 9 for 9. So that's extremely important. The other thing that happened this afternoon, which I think is a little bit actually quite comforting to know, is that he indicated earlier he thought he might need to take a little nap before we came over here, and then he asked if we could turn on the Golden State Sacramento game. And I said sure, and he became wonderfully animated and energized, and so we shared that opportunity as well. It was a lot of fun. To tell you a little bit about Michael, I think you read a little bit about his bio that we sent out. A couple of things that I pulled off that I haven't really spent a long time deciding what I'm going to say, but I'll just read a few things. He was ordained in the Presbyterian Church on July 27th, 1975. He was pastor of Presbyterian churches in Los Angeles and New York until 1985, when he returned to his alma mater, Princeton Theological Seminary, as director of admissions, and later as campus pastor and director of the chapel. After seminary, he immersed himself in a world that required a sociologist's insights. He was a sociology major at UCLA before he decided to go on to the theological seminary. So he immersed himself in a world that required a sociologist's insights and a pastor's heart. After 3 years as assistant pastor at St. Paul's Presbyterian Church, was a church that I attended as a child as well, he was called as pastor of another church there in Queens, New York. He quickly became active in the interracial, interfaith community-based Queens Citizens Organization, where he served as executive vice president. Cutting down about 90%, but I think it's nice to know a little of this about Michael. He has served as the executive director of the International Council of Churches. He has served as president of the National Council of Churches. He most recently stepped down as the chief senior interim senior minister at the Riverside Church, which is, I think, perhaps the most famous church in all of America. He mentioned that at one time they had over 200 people on staff and salary, with quite a large endowment and a lot of challenges and politics and concerns to be balanced and all of that. He is a writer and editor with numerous publications, articles, and book chapters. And I love this. It says, those who watch Livingston preside over meetings know he has a quick mind, a sense of humor, we sampled that this afternoon quite nicely, and a disarming manner for dealing with group tensions. These attributes serve him well in all that he has done. So it is my pleasure to welcome Reverend Michael Livingston.
Thanks, Doug. It's great to be introduced by your old student body president. I'm going to talk about Doug a little bit when I begin. Let me say, though, it's been one warm welcome after another since I've been here, and thanks to the Crinkles for hosting this. I understand you do this periodically, and I'm privileged and honored to be a guest in this gathering, and the first non-LDS. So clearly, if this doesn't go well, you can bring Doug for this. It's his idea. I said, Doug, I mean, we listened to a few of my sermons. Are you sure about this? Because I'm just going to be me. And I can say from a very brief, very pleasant conversation I had just a few moments ago, I know there will be things I'll say that may be unsettling, and I also know from that brief conversation that it won't end the conversation, that it will simply be an opportunity for sharing, for learning from one another, from growing together, which is surely a requirement for our society and world today. So let me dig into this. And there's a little bit of appreciation right here at the beginning of my text. I want to begin by expressing my profound appreciation to you for this invitation. That is your trust in the suggestion of my high school student body president. You know him perhaps better than I do, given your long association with him, with each other in this forum and the wider LDS community over the years. You should know that Doug was deeply appreciated by our multi-ethnic student body. South and Southwest Los Angeles, where Dorsey sat, was rocked by two profound events in the early and middle centuries, 60s rather, of the last century. The catastrophic failure of the Baldwin Hills Reservoir and Dam flooding the community below, and 2 years later, the Watts Rebellion, or uprising. Both contributed to the white flight from the residential communities that fed Audubon Junior High School and Dorsey High School. Doug's family could have abandoned the community and school as many, many whites did, moving further west toward the Pacific Ocean. But they didn't. Now, I don't know why they stayed. We've never had that conversation. but I know they didn't leave the community and the school because it had become predominantly a community and school of color, of people of color, primarily African American and Japanese. I can't imagine, Dorsey, my experience in high school without Doug. And it's been great to see him at reunions over the years and to reconnect more recently around making this event happen. I told some of the folks at dinner prior to this, seared in my memory is Doug playing Little Abner in the junior high school. Sorry about that. Now, you gotta get the overalls with the one strap down. Friday night, I'm at the airport on my way home from Louisville, Kentucky. Nancy was at home. And think about that for a moment. What happened in Louisville this last 10 days or so. I'm on my way home. I'm changing planes in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I need a bite to eat and a seat to watch a few minutes of the playoff game, Sixers-Nets. I get in line to enter a restaurant, wanting to sit at the bar where the only television showing the game was placed. I'm at the end of the line, and I hear the hostess, I don't see her, but I hear her ask, is there a single guest in line ready to be seated? I raise my hand and I take a step forward, not hearing or seeing others respond. A white man in front of me, talking with a woman, interrupts his conversation and says to me, "You're at the back of the line." I say pleasantly, "Yes, I know. I'm simply letting the hostess know my demographic. I'm alone and available for a single seat at the bar." He scolds now and rather loudly says, "What are you trying to do? You're at the back of the line." And I say, and I'm a little bit annoyed, "You're repeating yourself. I know where I am, and I don't really need you disciplining me." He says, "So what are you going to say next? Let's take this outside?" I think, but don't say, what kind of stereotype is clouding your vision? I do say, no, that hadn't crossed my mind. End of exchange. I finally get to the front of the line, and a white woman from the back of the line enters the restaurant through another entrance along the corridor, and she heads for the only seat at the bar. Well, I meet her there and I say, "We're all in line here. You'll have to wait, as we have." She says the two people entered from the back of the line and took 2 seats at the bar. And I respond, "Well, I'm not responsible for what they did, and I didn't even see it. I'm not aware of it." And she says, "Well, I'm taking this seat. It's open, and I'm going to sit there." A little bit annoyed now. And I say firmly, "No, that wouldn't be appropriate." I swear that's what I said. The hostess is seating people at the bar. You have to wait in line, as I and all these others have. She says derisively, "Well, I'm not going to argue with you." And she storms off. Doesn't even return to the line. She just leaves. I flag the bartender, and I point to the open seat, and she tells me it isn't ready yet. Actually, the place setting had been cleared. She either didn't see it or wasn't aware of it. Still, I stay in my place at the head of the line, See what I just did there? Stay in my. A minute later, I'm not making this up, 2 white men who haven't been in the line at all enter the restaurant from another angle and head for the now 2 open seats at the bar and are about to pass right in front of me. And I say, I'm sorry, but you can't just take those seats. The hostess and the bartender are seating people in every section, including the bar. One of them says, it's open seating at the bar. That's the practice. You just take a seat if it's open. And I say, the bartender just told me to wait. You can't really jump the line. He glares at me and mutters, and he and his friend walk away. Now all of this is happening in front of everyone who's been waiting in the line, and at least half the people at the bar, and it's quiet. And at last I'm seated, and the woman behind me is seated a few minutes later, and she's struggling with her bags and the high chair, and I say, is everything okay? Can I help? Are you having trouble? She doesn't say anything at all. She won't look at me or say anything at all to me. I'm the pariah. The quiet bar gradually returns to its normal conversation, laughter. Now, this doesn't happen to me all the time, not even very often, but often enough. And I'm a nice guy. I'm an educated guy. I have 2 master's degrees. I'm really nice, pleasant, unassuming. Just ask Doug. No trouble. Can't remember a fight. But this happens to me in an airport with people who are like us. Think about exchanges that take place when police officers stop cars with people of color, and the other kinds of experiences we've seen happen over and over and over again these last few years. This foundational feature in our nation, race, toxic from our beginning. It's in the air we breathe and the institutions that govern our life. Now let me tell you another story. And what I'm going to tell you is fact, not fiction. What you're seeing here is property owned by George Washington, first president of the United States. George and Martha Washington. They owned an enslaved woman named Ona Judge. I'm guessing none of you have ever heard this name. Ona was Martha's personal slave, following the service of her mother to Martha, a seamstress. She dressed Martha, made her clothes, cared for the clothes, made repairs on them, cleaned them, attended to her every personal need. She moved with the household wherever George took them. George Washington, the historians among you will know, perhaps others as well, was president at a time when the government was not located in Washington, D.C. There was no White House. For a brief time, the government was housed in New York City, and for a much longer period, throughout the entire period of his presidency, in where? Philadelphia. Speaking of religion, Philadelphia. God bless those Quakers. Philadelphia had legislation that permitted an enslaved person to sue for freedom after a period of 6 months residency in the state. When President Washington learned about this from the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, actually Randolph told Martha, not George, he knew he'd have to do something about it. So what did he do? Every 6 months, he moved his entire household either back to Mount Vernon or across the river, the Delaware River, to New Jersey. Perhaps to what is now Washington Crossing State Park, the site of his famous Revolutionary War crossing, or perhaps a few miles south to Trenton, New Jersey, where Nancy and I now live. Ona found out about this law, probably from this man, Reverend Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But like many African American preachers then and even since, Richard Allen had 2 other businesses alongside his ministry. He owned a chimney sweep business, and he was a cobbler, a shoemaker. And among his customers were George and Martha Washington. On May 10th, 1796, Martha gave Ona $1.25 to buy a pair of shoes, to have them made for her. There's a receipt for this purchase. So Ona would have gone to Reverend Allen's shoe shop on Spruce Street to have this pair of shoes made. And on this occasion and others, she could have planned her escape. She could also have met Reverend Allen at the Washington's home when he went there for a sweep of that presidential chimney Washington rented from a wealthy merchant, Robert Morris, at 190 High Street in Philadelphia. I'm giving you all this rich detail because you're going to look this up. I'm not making it up. The Washingtons lived in this house with their whole enslaved population from 1790 through 1797. So throughout that period, every 6 months, they moved. Philadelphia, Mount Vernon, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Mount Vernon. Declining a possible 3rd term, you all know this history, Washington prepared to move his family and all his property back to Mount Vernon from Philadelphia permanently. Ona, her enslaved relatives, and other members of the household knew about this impending permanent move, and Ona knew about something important that was also about to happen. This is Martha's granddaughter, Eliza Custis. Eliza announced her engagement to a young Englishman named Thomas Law, who had served the crown in India and brought with him to America not an Indian wife, but 2 mixed-race children fathered by an Indian mother. Eliza, headstrong, independent, troublesome by all accounts, and completely unprepared for running a household, Martha intended to give Ona as a gift, a wedding present to Eliza. Ona decided that life back in Virginia as a slave to unpredictable Liza and availability as a potential next sex object of John Law's desire A white man who slept with non-white women and didn't care who knew about it. This was not the life she wanted. Ona never returned to Mount Vernon, to slavery in Virginia, to ownership of the Washington. She took the Underground Railroad to freedom. Actually, Ona sailed on a ship to freedom with Richard Allen's help. She went by boat from slavery to freedom, residing eventually in New Hampshire after a sojourn in New York City. This is the announcement for Washington's place in the Philadelphia Gazette the day after they were certain Ona had left for good. Speaks for itself. George Washington was incensed at her escape. He never gave up trying to find her, and when he did, he dispatched an emissary to convince her she ought to voluntarily return to enslavement. He could not believe she preferred freedom to slavery on his plantation. This is what he said, a part of what he said after she left. His communication with his attorney general. Can you see that?
It's hard to see back here. Maybe you can read some of it, Michael?
Why don't you read it for me? Can you see it?
I gotta get my glasses on.
Anybody? Oh, go ahead.
So, you want me to read from the top?
Yes.
Okay, once found, Ona was presented with the option to return to enslavement in Washington's service. She declined, preferring freedom to re-enslavement. Washington wrote to his negotiator, for however well disposed I might be to gradual abolition, or even to an entire emancipation of that description of people, if the latter was in itself practicable at this moment, it would neither be politic or just to reward unfaithfulness with a premature preference.
Think about that for a while. Did you hear it? Marriage and family, and sadly, poverty and death in the North. That was Ona's eventual end. She was married, she had children. She lived in poverty, even in the North. And she died alone. Even in her last years, though, she reaffirmed her preference for freedom, despite the difficult life that she led. She was interviewed later in her life, and she said about her escape, these are her words, "Whilst they were packing up to go to Virginia, I was packing to go. I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I should never get my liberty." You can read about Ona in this book, published about four or 5 years ago. Never caught, can you see that? The Washington's relentless pursuit of their runaway slave, Ona Judge. I commend this to you. There is only one history of the United States. Things happened as they happened. That is, of course, nothing like a guarantee that we know the whole story. Details are obscured by bias. Narratives are shaped by victors. Heroes are fashioned out of priorities that guarantee particular outcomes. We tell the story that makes us who we want to be, not who we are. Even who we are at any given moment in our history is subject to political processes, controlled by narrow interests determined by race, gender, money, and power. You'll never read about Ona Judge in a history book in Texas or Florida or Georgia or Mississippi or Kentucky or Tennessee or Alabama or South Dakota. You can be proud that here in Colorado, the 2019 law encourages curriculum that, quote, highlights experiences and contributions of diverse groups. I hope the reality matches the aspiration. Some think of the Constitution of the United States as an unprecedented and unrivaled historical document, introducing democracy to civilization. I see a deeply flawed beginning with human beings stripped of their very humanity, made property, and legally subjected to the worst form of slavery ever conceived. All of this after informed debate by white men who freed themselves from British rule nowhere near as brutal as existed in the southern states of what would become the new Union. If you were a white man who didn't own property, if you were a woman, if you were a slave or a savage, slave, by the way, the word never appeared in the Constitution. You know what I mean by savage. You didn't count. You know, about 2/3 of a human being in the Constitution. That calculation was intended to balance congressional representation. Our nation has been broken since its inception. Genocide, the slave trade, plantation slavery are intertwined with the history we venerate and celebrate every 4th of July. Read Frederick Douglass's famous speech on what the 4th of July means to people, to black people, to enslaved people in this nation. Now, perhaps more than any moment in our history, our world is falling apart, especially for those who cannot accept the truth of our history and cling to the false narrative that the United States of America is a white Christian democracy. If you believe that, your world is falling apart. If you think the Civil War was fought to protect the sovereignty of southern states, you don't understand our history, and your world is falling apart. If you think there are multiple races, white, black, brown, red, and yellow, you don't understand biology, and your world is falling apart. If you think the white race is at the summit of a caste system and endowed with greater intelligence, beauty, God-given status, your world is falling apart. If you think your hard-earned gains in this nation are threatened by brown immigrants crossing the southern border, taking jobs that rightfully belong to white men and women, then your world is falling apart. If you think the playing field is no longer level and the achievements of people of color are not based on merit, but on a welfare state and woke politics, your world is falling apart. If you think January 6th was a peaceful demonstration by patriots, your world is falling apart. If you think Fox News is news, your world is falling apart. Especially after the recent Fox settlement. In the case, you know what I'm talking about. Settled because of their sure knowledge of willfully lying to the American public for years now, since the attempt to overturn the election and remove Joe Biden from the office of the presidency. Your world is falling apart if you think structural, systemic, institutional racism is either a myth or no longer a problem. Your world has fallen apart if you think Rosa Parks can be discussed in a classroom without reference to race, as has been proposed. Your world is fallen apart if you think the answer to black bodies being killed by policemen of any color is to increase funding for policing. The world is falling apart if you think more oil, more coal mines, more bombs and missiles will keep us safe. The assumption in this litany is the world that has fallen apart is the white world, the result of which are the particular manifestations that undermine the fabric of our society. Right now, conspiracy theories of every kind, book burnings and bannings, attacks on blacks increasing, and Jews and Asians and the LGBTQ community, and especially gender non-conforming and transgender folks. All of us marginalized as other. The unacknowledged reality lying tragically beneath that assumption and that result is the true history of genocide, enslavement, and terror that created the white world of privilege, opportunity, manifest destiny. Tragically, those who have been privileged paint themselves as victims. Not all, of course, but large numbers, perhaps in the tens of millions. And if so, they are victims of their own ignorance of history. That ignorance ignores the Trail of Tears, 1830 or 1850. June is just around the corner, Juneteenth. But that ignorance buries Executive Order number 3 in 1865, when the Emancipation Proclamation was translated into whatever language they speak in Texas. Enslaved blacks in Texas knew they were free. The point of the order was to stop white plantation owners from ignoring emancipation, accepting the defeat of the institution of slavery. Juneteenth, you know that term? Juneteenth meant blacks could celebrate in daylight. That ignorance renders invisible the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and Executive Order 9066, remanding Japanese American citizens to internment camps. Whites, white state and federal governments, white privilege, white supremacy, these have collapsed more worlds within the border of our nation than we have time to discuss. And the great irony of all of this is that the world is under great threat. All of us. Climate change is real. Some say we may have less than a few decades, not just some people, scientists, to effect changes to prevent our children and their children from living in a world of terrible, catastrophic events of the kind we are already experiencing. Unprecedented storms, earthquakes, flooding, warming seas, and rising shores. I feel like this is getting long. I think I'm going to skip this next section unless you tell me you want to hear it.
You're doing great.
We okay?
Give us what you got.
Nobody wants to get up and run out? All right, I'll tell you. Not long. Right now, in Atlanta, there is a struggle going on that encapsulates many of the deep tensions and divisions that are at the heart of the fallen world of our nation. The struggle is taking place on land of the Creek Confederacy, stolen land that before the Civil War became a plantation, and after the war, the land housed a notorious penitentiary that practiced convict leasing. Do you know that term? Another form of slavery. Land housing a landfill and hazardous waste facility bordering a historic Black community. The Atlanta City Council has given the green light to build a $90 million police and fire training facility, complete with an uninhabited mock city for real-world training, a driving course for high-speed chases, a firing range, land for their horses to graze. The protesters call it Cop City. A young Latinx professor, Manuel Terán, was killed a few months ago and a policeman wounded in an escalation of protest. The National Guard has been called in. The protesters argue it will embolden the police department in Atlanta and other cities to train police for urban warfare tactics, with equipment to suppress dissent and terrorize Black and poor communities. That's from a New York Times article, March 7th of this year. Environmentalists want to preserve a precious green space, one of the last and largest urban forests in Atlanta and the country. Our nation is broken, our world falling apart, and truth is the only way to put it back together, to bind us to one another, to begin again from a deep place of acknowledgement of our shared past, our common history, and the bloody path we took to get here. Shifting gears, just a bit. I wonder where is all my relation? That's the inscription at the top of this pottery. David Drake, Dave the Potter. There's an art historian among us, I think, who may know of Dave the Drake, and may not. I'll say more. David Drake, Dave the Potter, inscribed those words on one of the many pots he made while enslaved to a number of slaveholders. That seems too benign. Let's call them what they were, slave makers. He may have been thinking about Lucy and her two sons, sold away from the plantation where they were held, all of them, in bondage. His loss and pain glazed and sealed for all time. Were they married? He and Lucy? Were the two boys his? Part of his family? On one of his pots, he carved the one word, catenation. He misspelled it, an I for an E. Hard to see here, but the word is there. concatenation, I'd never heard of it until I read about Dave the Potter. It means the state of being yoked or chained. He wrote it in April of 1836, 2 years after South Carolina passed a punitive anti-literacy law to prevent enslaved people from learning to write. The full text on Dave's pot, the first slide I showed you, is this. I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all and every nation. So you want to prevent our history, Black history, United States history from being taught because your world is falling apart? You do that and we never learn about Dave. His inspiring, uplifting humanity, his dignity, his wit and intelligence, what his life can teach us about what it means to live and thrive through whatever condition. My favorite inscription on one of his jars is, LM says, this handle will crack. LM, Lewis Miller, was Dave's, this human being's, owner in 1856. Well, the handle didn't crack. You can see it in a museum today. The cantonation jar was auctioned for $370,000. I wonder if Lucy's great-grandchildren will share in the profit. A journalist interviewed Toni Morrison once. You can find this exchange on YouTube. She asked, you know who Toni Morrison is? Of course, I'm sorry. I just smacked me for insulting me like that. This journalist asked, the interviewer asked if Toni might ever consider expanding her work, her writing, to include white characters. Toni said, you have no idea how racist that question is. You'd never ask a white author if they would consider including black characters, people of color, in their work. Your world has fallen apart when you're forced to consider the humanity of people you've been taught over the centuries to regard as inhuman. That's the world we're living in now. Tens of millions of white citizens, most of them Republicans, but not all. Some independents who can't conceive of sharing this nation and world with people who don't look like them. People who cut their lawns, dry their cars at the car wash, pick up their garbage, give them pedicures and manicures, perform complex surgeries, run corporations, teach in public schools, write books, make music, sit on the Supreme Court. Whose world has fallen apart? Ours. The only world we'll ever know on earth. The deep and profound sadness and tragedy of all of this is the passionate participation of people of faith in these degradations. It's no secret that religious fundamentalists of any stripe contribute to the animosity and hatred that poison the social and political environment in local and national and political society, and in relations among the nations of the world. How different would our country be without rabid white Christian nationalists who don't understand the difference between faith and patriotism, gospel and narrow political platforms, our all-embracing God and distorted personal piety? How different would our world be without fundamentalist perversions of Islam and Zionism that betray the expansive vision of the Hebrew tradition at its prophetic best? But I don't want to seem to cast blame on other religions. My own Protestant Reformed tradition, Presbyterianism, has a despicable history with regard to race. I mentioned that I came from Louisville, not to this body just yet, but a meeting of the Presbyterian Historical Society. A one-time member of that board, William Yu, he's Korean, South Korean, wrote a book called What Kind of Christianity? A History of Slavery and Anti-Black Racism in the Presbyterian Church of my ordination. He writes this in one place. In the antebellum United States, much of white Presbyterianism was under the captivity of American slavery. After 1830, white slave-owning Presbyterians and other proponents of slavery responded to the growth of the abolitionist movement with a ferocious flurry of literature in periodicals, pamphlets, and books to justify black enslavement. One historian estimates that white clergy produced almost half of all defenses of slavery published in America. And Presbyterian pastors were responsible for more pro-slavery writings than clergy from any other Christian tradition. That's my church. Whether LDS or RC, Roman Catholic, or Hindu, or Muslim, or Episcopalian, or Lutheran, we must all interrogate our histories and our current practices for traces of the disease that infects us all. The hubris, the arrogance, the blindness that bars us from seeing the other as less than, inferior to our own exalted view of ourselves and the rightness of my understanding of God. I very much appreciated viewing the presentation made at your last gathering by Dr. Patrick Mason. Did most of you hear that? It was, I commend it to you then. I don't see a lot of hits. Now they hear, oh, okay, well, there's a few more. It's on YouTube. Doug sent the link to me. And here, I love this, and I didn't write it, so how about reading that for me?
Sure. Renovation projects. When we have conquered this pandemic, and we will, may we be equally committed to freeing the world from the virus of hunger, freeing neighborhoods and nations from the virus of poverty. May we hope for schools where children are taught, not terrified they will be shot, and for the gift of personal dignity for every child of God, unmarred by any form of racial, ethnic, or religious prejudice.
That's why I got into ministry. That, right there. A child of the 60s, my call came through a sense of the church as being fundamentally concerned about the transformation of individuals and our society, about caring about our neighbor. You know the scriptures. Who is my neighbor. Most of what I know about the LDS is from stereotypes, no doubt 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. And I was profoundly enlightened listening to his presentation. And he also said this.
And it shall come to pass that the Lord shall commence his work among all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people to bring about the restoration of his people among earth.
From, I don't know what that is. What is that? Tell me what it is.
It's a scripture from the Book of Mormon.
It's a scripture from the Book of Mormon. I love this. This strain is in almost all of our religious traditions. And most of us have strayed from this kind of understanding of what God requires of us in the world, attending to our own more narrow and focused concerns. Since I talked so badly about the Presbyterian Church and that from William Yu's book, let me share something that will recapture some of the spirit of these last two slides. The Presbyterian system of government is found in the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church, USA. Presbyterianism is simply a form of government. It's a polity. It's how we organize ourselves to be the church. The Reformed tradition, and Presbyterians in particular, are just had my 74th birthday. A representative democracy, after which our own government is patterned. And here's language from the Book of Order. The Presbyterian system of government in the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church is established in light of Scripture, but is not regarded as essential for the existence of the Christian church, nor required of all Christians. Be Mormon. That's okay with us. Be Buddhist, or Episcopalian, or Roman Catholic, or a part of the Islamic community worldwide. We don't insist that you be who we are. That's at the heart of what it means for us. We're fundamentally and by rule of our own order, ecumenical and interfaith. And one more, and then I promise I'm done. Which one? There are two. I'm going to get it. In Christ, by the power of the Spirit, God unites persons through baptism, regardless of race, ethnicity, age, sex, disability, geography, or theological conviction. Presbyterians don't all have to think and believe the same way. You have to proclaim Christ, Lord and Savior. Period. There is therefore no place in the life of the church for discrimination against any person. The church shall guarantee full participation and representation in its worship, governance, and emerging life to all persons or groups within its membership. No member shall be denied participation or representation for any reason other than those stated in this Constitution. And don't worry, that's not tricky language with all sorts of other things that get you later. This has to do with fundamental breaches of authority, the abuse of a child, that kind of thing. In Jesus Christ, who is the Lord of all creation, the church seeks a new openness to God's mission in the world. In Christ, the triune God tends the least among us, suffers the curse of human sinfulness, raises up a new humanity, and promises a new future for all creation. In Christ, church members share with all humanity the realities of creatureliness, sinfulness, brokenness and suffering, as well as the future toward which God is drawing them. The mission of God pertains not only to the church, but also to people everywhere and to all creation. We have no hope of renewal, no hope of building a sustainable future if we do not tell ourselves the truth about our own history. Hold accountable those who insist on preferencing their own race as if that meant anything eternal. There is only one race. The big lie we've told ourselves is there are many races: white, brown, yellow, black, red, and worse, a hierarchy, a caste system from white to black. We are one people, the whole world over. The sooner we honor that reality, the sooner will we be able to confront the challenges that face us and overcome them, or perish for lack of the effort. Thank you. You get to come back. You get to say, why did you say that? Whatever you'd like to say. I'm happy to just have a dialogue. Hear your comments or questions. The floor is yours.
I have a question.
Yes.
You've spoken a lot about our history and our need to understand what really happened. I have a question for you. When we have these symbols of like statues or street names or buildings of things that were part of that era of slavery, should we get rid of all those?
Great question. We all have opinions about this. I'll tell you a story. So I'm traveling. There was a period when I worked in Washington, D.C. And I'm returning a car to the car rental agency. I'm driving down the street. This is Dulles, Washington National. And I approach this street. I got to make a right turn, and I look up, and it's Jefferson Davis Boulevard. Now, why are we honoring Jefferson Davis Boulevard? Why are we honoring Jefferson Davis? Let me turn it around and ask you. Why are we honoring Jefferson Davis, the president of a group of states which seceded from the Union, which desired to continue owning human beings as property rather than seek a unified nation and surrender that odious, to put it mildly, practice. Jefferson Davis should not be honored. No, there should be, in my opinion, no street named Jefferson Davis, no statue of Lee riding a horse in
So could I extend
Richmond,
that?
Virginia.
I totally agree with you, we should take that down. Should we take down the Washington Monument?
That's a tough one.
I just want to make it a little harder.
Yeah, so of course, some of the proposals are that these some of them, not Jefferson Davis is gone.
Yeah.
But some of them ought to have a plaque or a QR code with a fuller context for their contribution to the founding of the nation. Absolutely, George Washington played a critical role in forming what we know of as the United States of America today. And that ought to be recognized and celebrated. And he owned a judge and other enslaved persons, and was personally insulted that she would seek freedom, liberty, rather than continued enslavement on his plantation. Let's teach both of these things. Let's see him for the full, flawed human being that he was. The one does not negate the other. We have only heard the one and not the other. So, okay, let's keep the phallic symbol. I'm sorry. But let's tell the whole story. That's what I'm saying. But there are a whole number of them that ought to go. All those bases down south named after those generals. Gotta go. Yes?
But once you destroy all those names and all those bad events, nobody questions anymore because they're non-existent. History disappears. Isn't it a little more valuable to ask that as a question? See this statue and tell the whole story, but you take away all the statues, you take away all the bad people in history. Should we forget Hitler and Mao and Stalin and Lenin? You know,
You will not see a single statue, plaque honoring Hitler in Germany. You know what you will see? You'll see a placard with the life details of every single Jewish person killed in that war.
right, the stones in the.
Yes, that's telling the truth. No, I'm not suggesting we erase history. I'm saying let's tell it. When you stop having Robert E. Lee Day on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, I'm not getting the day wrong. I think that's when the celebration. When you stop doing that, when you stop venerating Lee and Jefferson and all the others, and accept that the war, I mean you personally of course, that the war was about slavery, it's in the documents of secession. When you start telling the truth about that, it will be more able, we will be more able to see these things in their fuller context. No, they need to go. They need to go until the truth is told, the whole truth. Yes.
I want to thank you for honoring my beliefs through your presentation and including things that I cherish, even though we have a very imperfect history with race relations ourselves as our church. I love Jeffrey Holland and I love the Book of Mormon, so thank you for honoring ideals that we fall short of too, but we want. So thank you.
Thank you. Mhm. Yes.
You can clearly see that we're a religious community and mostly white Americans. So my question to you is, what do you hope for us in terms of how we can help this history, this institutionalized history that you have shared? Because I think, to your credit, you've tried to share fact so that we get a broader picture of history that we haven't learned a lot about. And so, again, what do you expect? What do you hope? What do you recommend for us that we can do?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So I hope that you will see through the thinly veiled racism, sexism. Well, let's stick with race. Not broaden this too far. Women are victims in all of this too, right? If you weren't a woman, you didn't have, and you weren't in the Constitution either. But to see through these thinly veiled racist attempts by the far right, Ron DeSantis, to control what is taught in schools to our children. And there's an assault. Yesterday's New York Times told a story of what's happening at the University of Virginia, where there is a concerted effort to overwhelm the Board of Trustees of that university with very, very conservative folks who oppose DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and who paint that as woke politics, interrupting the purity of education and funding it in beyond what ought to happen, while at the same time stripping from that state, that university, the ability to include curriculum that tell the kind of story that I'm saying here. This is politics, and it's politics that encourages blindness and ignorance of the kind I've been talking about. So see that kind of thing and call it out. And then continue to work on your own community so that the next time somebody like me comes here, they'll see a broader representation of, I hope, your own church, not to mention Denver or the society at large. I am always, I'll just say it, a little bit suspect of rooms where there are only white people in it. What's that Hamilton line? I want to be the political room where that something's happening here, and there's a whole lot of folks like me who don't know what it is. Now, it may be very good stuff. You're educating yourselves. But I bet there's more work to be done among you around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right here in your own church, ward, give me the language. Stake, wards and stakes, presbyteries and synods. And I encourage you to do that. Broaden, deepen your circle. Those two things at least. Yes, one more it looks like, and then we'll.
Oh, sorry, really quick. I absolutely believe white privilege is a very real thing. But I also understand we have a lot of blind spots. How do we spot our blind spots? How do we, see past the veil?
Yeah. You have to welcome other voices, invite other voices, other perspectives, be in dialogue with people who aren't like you, look like you, live like you. You have to hear and see the other, tough as that is sometimes. Or it's hard to see your own blind spots. Hard for me to see my own blind spots. Nancy and I have a very different opinion about who I am. I'm 49 years in July. I'm still trying to, yes, I hear you. Yes, I'm not impatient. You have my full attention. Yes. What I'm about is not any more important than what you're about. But it's in dialogue with the other as often as you can. I think that's the only way to see past your own blind spots. You don't know what your blind spots are, but people around you do. You just need more people around you who see more things about you.
Out of your comfort zone.
Yes, out of your comfort zone. Thank you again. Yes.
I think that's actually a very good way to sort of acknowledge what we've been doing tonight. I think we've been stretched. I don't expect all of us to agree on everything that Michael has said, but hopefully heard his invitation to us, we're willing to listen, to think, to.
Okay, can I interrupt you? So, look, if you are right where he said, I don't expect all of you to agree with everything he said. You have to not be shy about saying, I didn't like that thing, right? Or it's not useful. If it's just you dialoguing in your own head, what he said there disgusted me. I think it was fundamentally at odds with my values. If you just keep that to yourself, that's not encountering your faith.